Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Kai had once believed that his loyalty to Drew was the right decision, a bold, selfless gesture that proved his commitment to a shared vision and his faith in a future where order and justice could be restored in Port Charles through the Esplanade project. When Curtis and Trina started digging into the shady undercurrents surrounding the project, Kai made a conscious choice to betray them. He covertly fed information to Drew, hoping to sabotage their investigation before it gained traction. In his mind, he wasn't acting out of malice, but conviction, convinced that Drew's cause was greater, cleaner, and worth defending. Trina, who had once looked at him as a steadfast ally and perhaps something more, became collateral damage in a scheme he told himself was for the greater good. But what Kai didn't realize then was that he had stepped into a web of power games far more treacherous than he imagined, a world where allegiance was temporary, and loyalty was a tool, sharpened only to be discarded when dull. Drew, for all his charm and strategic brilliance, viewed people in terms of utility. Kai, at first, was useful, a silent weapon embedded within Curtis's circle, capable of delivering intelligence without raising suspicion. But when Sidwell's betrayal began to unravel everything Drew had built, when the revelations of bribery, coercion, and manipulation within the court system began to taint the Esplanade dream, Drew became desperate. Sidwell had outplayed him, bribing Judge Eva Heron and orchestrating a courtroom collapse that cost Willow her child and her sanity. Drew, blindsided and humiliated, turned his wrath elsewhere, refusing to see himself as the architect of his downfall. In a chilling act of self-preservation, he sacrificed Kai without hesitation, offering him up as a scapegoat to distract from his own culpability. He fed Curtis just enough truth to ignite fury, painting Kai as the mole who had infiltrated from the beginning. Curtis, already reeling from Drew's manipulations and Jacinda's mysterious disappearance, felt the betrayal burn twice as hot, once as a professional stab in the back, and once as a personal wound, considering Kai's former bond with Trina. What had once been an uneasy truce became open hostility. Kai, abandoned by Drew, became the hunted. No longer shielded by influence or protected by alliances, he was exposed in the harshest light. Faced with the consequences of his actions, Kai turned to the only person whose forgiveness he thought he could still earn, Trina. But when he found her, he saw not the warmth of an old connection, but the hardened gaze of someone deeply wounded. Trina, having witnessed firsthand how Drew's actions shattered Willow in court and knowing Kai had chosen to side with that man, had no sympathy left to offer. Her silence was colder than any outburst. When Kai tried to explain, to beg, to reach her heart, Trina's rejection was simple but brutal. She would not save a man who had once chosen betrayal over truth. That moment shattered Kai. He understood then that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it corrodes identity. He was no longer the man Trina once trusted. He wasn't even sure he was someone worth saving anymore. Meanwhile, Drew's world continued to implode in slow motion. As the dust settled from Sidwell's exit and the courtroom disaster, Drew began wielding the knowledge of Sidwell's corruption like a weapon. He strategized how to reverse the custody ruling, how to invalidate the court's decision, how to claw back control from Michael and Willow under the guise of justice. But the damage had already been done. Carly, once fiercely protective of Drew, began to see through the cracks, recognizing not a noble partner, but a cold tactician. Michael, suspicious and cautious, started distancing himself, questioning whether Drew's actions were about love for Willow or sheer obsession with power. And Willow, the woman Drew claimed to protect, felt nothing but betrayal. The man she had relied on during her most fragile moments had let another man dismantle her life while pretending to stand at her side. Sidwell, the shadow puppeteer behind so much destruction, vanished as swiftly as he had appeared. Rumors swirled that he had resurfaced elsewhere, targeting new ventures and laying traps for new victims. Jason, growing wary of the chaos, began tracing Sidwell's steps, sensing that the villain's ambitions stretched beyond Drew's fall. But by now, Drew's name was already stained. And in a city like Port Charles, reputation was everything. Kai, left to wander through the debris of his own ruined image, became a pariah. Former friends kept their distance. No alliances remained to call upon. Curtis, though not yet retaliating with violence, made it clear that Kai was no longer welcome in his circle. The walls of Port Charles, once familiar, now closed in like a prison. Every glance, every whisper, reminded Kai of what he had done, and more painfully, who he had lost. In the quiet corners of the city, where truth lingers like smoke after fire, Kai began to unravel. His days were filled with regret, his nights haunted by Trina's eyes and Drew's betrayal. He saw now that loyalty, when misplaced, could be lethal, not only to those betrayed but to the betrayer himself. He had given his soul to a cause that didn't want him, for a man who never cared, and in the process, he lost everything real. And so, the consequences of Drew's ambition, Sidwell's cunning, and Kai's misguided loyalty rippled across Port Charles like a virus, infecting trust, love, and alliances. What was once a city of order became a breeding ground for suspicion and revenge. The Esplanade project, once seen as a beacon of progress, now stood as a symbol of greed, deception, and the cost of loyalty bought too cheaply. In that world, no allegiance went unpunished, and no betrayal was ever truly forgotten. The trail of devastation left behind by Sidwell was no longer just collateral damage, it had become the defining upheaval shaking the very foundation of Port Charles. What had begun as a calculated move to pressure Holly into returning a stolen diamond by strapping a bomb to Sasha's body, had now spiraled into a ruthless campaign of manipulation, coercion, and systematic corruption. Sidwell had leveraged the weaknesses of those around him with surgical precision. By infiltrating the judicial system, bribing Judge Eva Heron, and engineering a custody ruling that ripped Willow's child away from her, he didn't just manipulate the law, he weaponized it. He made the courts an extension of his influence and transformed Michael from a grieving father into a legally empowered one, not through merit, but through conspiracy. Yet, Port Charles was no longer the city Sidwell believed he could control from the shadows. Jason, ever watchful and unrelenting, had begun tracking Sidwell's movements. At first, Jason believed this was merely a vendetta, Sidwell punishing Drew for some personal offense or using Sasha as a pawn in a territorial war. But as the pieces fell into place, Jason realized that Sidwell's betrayals were not isolated acts. They were deliberate plays in a much grander scheme, one aimed at destabilizing the very pillars of power that held Port Charles together. Law enforcement, the judicial system, media, and even long-standing family dynasties like the Quatermains were being quietly undermined, restructured to benefit a future that only Sidwell understood. The most damning realization was that those who once believed they were orchestrating the game were now merely pawns. Drew, once confident in his ability to manipulate circumstances and people alike, now found himself unraveling. He had lost control over the narrative, over his alliances, over his public persona. His credibility, once bolstered by strategic partnerships and political foresight, had crumbled beneath the weight of failed gambits and exposed betrayals. The revelation that Sidwell had been working against him all along shattered Drew's internal compass. Those around him could no longer see him as the strong, calculated leader he had pretended to be. Carly kept her distance, disillusioned by the ruthlessness she once admired. Michael, caught between gratitude for the custody ruling and suspicion about the means used to obtain it, started pulling away. And Willow, shattered by what had been done to her in the courtroom, saw Drew no longer as a protector, but as a co-conspirator in her undoing. Love had withered, respect had died, and trust had turned to ash. In a strange twist of fate, Kai, now fully abandoned, began to mirror Drew in a tragic, poetic way. Once driven by the belief that he was serving a greater cause, Kai now stood alone, stripped of his allies and cast out by the very people he thought he was protecting. His betrayal of Curtis and Trina had turned him into a symbol of everything wrong with misguided loyalty. No one reached out to save him. No one believed his excuses. Even Drew, the man he had once risked everything to serve, had cut him loose without hesitation. As Kai wandered the fractured social landscape of Port Charles, the isolation suffocated him. Every corner he turned was met with glares, whispers, and avoidance. The halls of General Hospital, once a place of purpose, now felt like a tomb echoing the final collapse of his reputation. Curtis, long simmering with fury, eventually confronted Kai in an explosive encounter. But there was no need for fists or shouting. Curtis's rage spoke through the silence, through the bitterness in his eyes. His message was clear: Kai's betrayal had already destroyed any chance at redemption. It wasn't just about Curtis's trust or Trina's heartbreak. It was about the larger implications of Kai's choices, how he had empowered a predator like Drew to infiltrate and corrupt from within. That confrontation wasn't a climax, but an execution of judgment. Kai was already spiritually broken. He didn't need to be dragged out, he had already exiled himself. That moment forced him to face something far more terrifying than Curtis's fury or Trina's rejection. He had to look at himself and reckon with the man he had become. A betrayer who had been betrayed, a tool discarded by a master who never saw him as more than an expendable resource. The quiet that followed was not peace, it was the silence of a life imploded. Meanwhile, Jason continued piecing together Sidwell's broader plot. As he peeled back the layers, it became apparent that Sidwell's reach extended beyond the current chaos. Offshore accounts, encrypted communications with foreign entities, and unexplained shipments tied to the Esplanade development hinted at international agendas and a much deeper rot. Jason suspected that Sidwell's aim wasn't just power, it was total structural upheaval. The crime families, the courts, the hospitals, and the press were all being reconfigured under Sidwell's remote hand, like a general preparing for a silent war. Port Charles had always been a city of secrets, of tangled loyalties and blurred morality. But now, it was something else entirely, a battlefield where the rules were being rewritten in real time, and the old players no longer knew how to fight. Drew was disarmed not by violence, but by betrayal. Kai was disqualified not by law, but by moral implosion. And Sidwell, the Shadow King, moved further out of reach, watching as his enemies crumbled from within. In that shifting landscape, even Jason knew he could no longer fight alone. He needed new allies, new strategies, and a ruthless clarity of purpose. The city had been wounded, not by a single act, but by the accumulation of betrayals that no one had seen coming until it was too late. And as Kai faded into irrelevance, and Drew faced the ruins of his own empire, Jason prepared for the next phase, not of vengeance, but of reckoning. The storm Sidwell had unleashed was not over, and the next casualties might not even see it coming until it was too late. What began as a grand vision for the future of Port Charles, the Esplanade project, has devolved into one of the most chilling cautionary tales in the city's history. The trio once at its center, Drew, Kai, and Sidwell, are no longer players in a strategic urban redevelopment venture. They have become the embodiment of a deeper rot that runs through the very foundation of power and trust in Port Charles. Their story is no longer one of ambition, it is a grim narrative of manipulation, betrayal, and the irreversible consequences of compromising integrity in pursuit of control. Drew had once imagined himself a visionary. A reformer who could usher in a new age by outmaneuvering the city's criminal undercurrents, eliminating corruption, and restoring faith in leadership through civic progress. In aligning with Sidwell, Drew believed he had secured a powerful ally, someone who, like him, wanted to reshape Port Charles into something better, something cleaner. Together with Ezra, they envisioned the Esplanade as more than just a luxury development, it would be a symbol, a stronghold for a new order. But this idealistic facade quickly crumbled under the weight of their own deception. Sidwell was never a reformer, he was a tactician with a predator's instincts. He didn't seek to build, he sought to infiltrate, to infect, and to tear down the existing hierarchy from within. Drew never saw it coming. He was too focused on his enemies, Sonny, Carly, Curtis, to recognize that the greatest threat sat right beside him. When Sidwell manipulated the judicial system, bribing Judge Eva Heron to strip Willow of custody rights and hand full control to Michael, Drew didn't just lose a legal battle, he lost the soul of his cause. The very courtroom where he had once stood as an advocate for justice became the scene of a public implosion. Willow's mental breakdown wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was the public unraveling of Drew's credibility. The man who had promised to protect her had failed her in the most fundamental way. And when the truth emerged, when Drew finally realized that Sidwell had orchestrated the entire collapse from behind the scenes, his response wasn't remorse. It was calculation. In the desperate scramble to salvage his legacy, he needed a scapegoat. And that scapegoat was Kai. Kai had walked into this storm with noble intentions. At least, that's what he told himself. When Curtis and Trina began to question the motives behind the Esplanade project, Kai chose to side with Drew. He fed information to Drew in secret, undermining Curtis's strategies, sabotaging Trina's investigations, and rationalizing it all as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. He believed Drew when he said this was about cleaning up Port Charles. He believed Drew valued him, respected him, saw him as more than just a tool. But Kai was wrong. Dead wrong. When Drew was cornered, he didn't hesitate to discard Kai like a pawn. He turned over his name, his betrayal, and his entire history to Curtis, not as a confession, but as a deflection. It was a tactical sacrifice, cold, calculated, and final. For Kai, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Curtis's rage was a storm of betrayal, but the wound that hurt most came from Trina. When Kai sought her out, begging not just for forgiveness, but for a chance to explain, he found no mercy in her eyes. Only heartbreak, and a resolve sharpened by pain. Trina had seen too much, endured too much. The betrayal had been too personal. She couldn't forgive a man who had sold her out for a cause that was never real. Her silence was not a lack of feeling, it was the loudest rejection Kai had ever experienced. That moment destroyed him more completely than any punishment could. Now cast out from both Drew's circle and the Winters family, Kai became a phantom in his own city. Port Charles, once a maze of potential and power, now offered him no sanctuary. Former colleagues avoided him. Allies withdrew. And those who once considered him a friend now regarded him with scorn. Even General Hospital, where he had once felt some semblance of purpose, became a place of quiet humiliation. Every corner reminded him of what he'd lost, not just relationships or opportunity, but his own sense of self. Meanwhile, Drew continued to spiral. With Sidwell gone underground and the Esplanade project in ruins, Drew attempted to reclaim ground through legal warfare. He planned to use Sidwell's bribery as leverage to reverse Willow's custody case, to wrest control back from Michael, to claw his way out of disgrace. But it was too late. Carly saw through him. Michael, once his ally, grew increasingly wary. Willow, devastated and furious, wanted nothing more to do with him. The man who had once held so much influence now stood surrounded by the debris of his own manipulation. He had no one left to fight for, and no cause left to justify his behavior. His fall from grace wasn't explosive, it was slow, suffocating, and silent. The kind of descent that leaves nothing behind but echoes and shadows. And still, Sidwell's legacy loomed. Jason, relentless in his pursuit, had begun connecting the dots. Sidwell's sabotage wasn't random, it was strategic. From the bombing threat against Sasha to the manipulation of the judiciary, everything pointed to a broader conspiracy. Jason suspected that Sidwell had embedded himself deeper into Port Charles than anyone had anticipated, targeting not just Drew, but the entire power structure, media, law, and commerce. Sidwell was reshaping the city not with construction, but with chaos. And the players left in his wake, Drew, Kai, Michael, even Carly, were only now beginning to grasp the scale of what had been unleashed. The tale of Drew, Kai, and Sidwell is no longer a subplot, it is the core narrative of a city unraveling. It is the story of how idealism curdles into corruption, how loyalty becomes weaponized, and how betrayal infects like a disease. In this new Port Charles, the rules have changed. The lines between hero and villain have blurred beyond recognition. Trust is no longer a currency, it's a liability. And in the ruins of failed alliances and broken dreams, a new chapter is being written. Not in boardrooms. Not in courtrooms. But in silence. In blood. In the tear-stained regrets of those who thought they were in control. Port Charles, once again, bears witness to the cost of ambition unchecked, of loyalty misplaced, and of the irreversible consequences of letting betrayal become the language of power. And so, in the haunting stillness that follows devastation, Port Charles stands as a city irrevocably changed, not by war, not by natural disaster, but by the quiet, insidious erosion of trust. The names Drew, Kai, and Sidwell are now etched not in triumph, but in infamy. They are no longer architects of change but cautionary tales, living reminders of how quickly purpose can become pretense, and how easily conviction can be manipulated into betrayal. Drew, once poised to be a reformer, ends this chapter as a man stripped bare, not just of allies and influence, but of the very identity he built his power upon. He walks the streets not as a visionary, but as a cautionary echo, proof that power pursued without integrity leads only to isolation. The people who once stood beside him have scattered. Willow's love has soured into resentment. Michael's loyalty has hardened into suspicion. Carly's respect has burned away, revealing only quiet condemnation. Drew is not destroyed by force, but by the erosion of every relationship he once weaponized. Kai, cast into the shadows, becomes a ghost haunting the edges of a city he no longer belongs to. His downfall is not loud or explosive, but agonizing in its loneliness. No courtroom verdict. No public outcry. Just the aching silence of a man watching every bridge he ever built collapse into ashes.